I remember playing Mario Sunshine as a kid and seeing Pinna Park off in the distance, thinking, why can't I just swim right over there? I loved exploring Isle Delfino, but I was always abruptly reminded whenever I would bump into an invisible wall or find a random death barrier that I was just playing a video game, not exploring an actual tropical island. But now, it feels like every game that comes out has been specifically made to scratch that itch. Open world games, games without loading screens interrupting every major area, and games without story missions or locked doors constantly blocking you from exploring. Games that feel interconnected and reward exploration in their design. Now, this type of game is absolutely everywhere. Okay, to be fair, open world games definitely existed in the early 2000s and even quite a bit before, depending on your definition of open world. But they weren't as ubiquitous as they are today. I mean, Legend of Zelda Wind Waker came out around the same time as Sunshine, and I played them both as a kid. In that game, you could sail anywhere in the game world after a certain point in the story. And while there were technically no loading screens between the islands, there were really long stretches of nothing but open ocean. This was, in a way, its own loading screen, because the hardware at the time couldn't load each individual island fast enough, and so they needed those stretches of empty space to hide the loading going on in between islands. This is why in the Wii U remake a few years later, they gave you a faster sail, because the hardware had caught up to the vision of the developers, and they were able to make the game a little more seamless. And of course, even as early as 2001, Grand Theft Auto 3 was massively popular at the time for being one of the only games with a true three-dimensional open world. But slowly, hardware started to evolve. Onboard RAM got larger and faster, and storage devices began to transition to solid state, which made them load data way faster. As soon as games got large enough to be stored on disks, computers couldn't load the entire game all at once. So when they needed to transition between areas, they needed to load and unload certain parts of the game. And that was slow, so you kind of needed loading zones as a necessity for a lot of games. But now, load times can be fast enough that world streaming is viable. But what is world streaming? That's essentially where you break up the game world into different chunks and load and unload them as you get nearer or farther away. The key difference here is that the loading is happening during gameplay. The reason older games weren't able to do this is because loading takes up a lot of resources and could cause the game to stutter or stop completely for a few seconds. If the hardware is fast enough though, and if what you're loading isn't too demanding, you can load it in without a noticeable effect to gameplay. And when the entire landscape of a game is managed to be loaded this way, that's what we call world streaming. The most well-known and easy to understand example of this would be Minecraft. Even as a casual player, you have a pretty clear idea of what is loaded and unloaded, and you have direct control over how many chunks you want to load at once based on your computer hardware or personal preference. But here's the thing, almost every open world game uses this same concept to differing effects. Now, it's not necessarily square chunks of the entire game world. Some games have the terrain loaded all at once, but then enemies or certain specific entities only load when you get close enough to them. Usually, games will try to hide this to make it feel more seamless with a fade-in effect or maybe a fog layer to hide just what's behind the unloaded area. But sometimes you can still get what's called pop-in, where things just sort of appear right in front of you as they're loaded in. To help prevent this pop-in effect, there's another trick that games do to hide their loading while still keeping an expansive and distant horizon. This is called LOD, or level of detail, where a certain object in the game might have a bunch of different models with varying levels of detail, so that as you get farther away from something, it can get replaced with a simpler model that's easier on the processor. Ideally, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference from far away, and as you get closer, it becomes more and more detailed. Sometimes you still get sort of a pop-in effect where something suddenly becomes really detailed while you're close to it, and if the blending isn't done quite right, it can still kind of ruin the immersion, but it's still better than something just appearing out of nowhere. For example, a lot of times trees in games are fully rendered 3D models, but if you get far enough away, they turn into just flat 2D sprites that are always facing the player. And going back to the Minecraft example, there's actually a pretty popular mod in development right now that adds level of detail style loading to chunks outside of your normal render distance, where it essentially takes the information of a chunk that was loaded at one point and then makes a simpler, easier to render model to show the player from far away. And if you've ever seen those videos of those people flying around their Minecraft worlds and it looks like they have their render distance set to 1 billion, that's how they're doing it. All of that is pretty much just to say that between a combination of better hardware and smarter software tricks that have developed over time, computers are just a lot better now. And because of that, it's easier than ever now to actually create an open world game. And so the obvious reason as to why we're seeing so many more open world games now is that the technology allows for it. But technology alone doesn't guarantee good design. It never has. It allows for certain things to be realized that couldn't before, but it doesn't mean that open world design is the best way to make a video game. It's just a different way. It doesn't take long to find an open world game with huge empty spaces full of nothing. Just because you can make an open world doesn't mean you have to. And it seems like the larger gaming audience as a whole is starting to get a fatigue to these massive maps in these games, with a laundry list of chores to do that rarely feels like you're actually exploring and just kind of going through the motions. And if your goal is just to design the game with the biggest map, I mean, Daggerfall already beat you back in the 90s. Daggerfall had an in-game map size of over 209,000 square kilometers, or roughly the size of Great Britain. But the vast majority of the map is just procedurally generated empty space, meant to give travel a resource cost, more so than to give the player a sandbox to explore and discover. What makes exploration engaging has nothing to do with size. Players who want to explore want more condensed and better use of space, so that whatever size game world they do play in feels more alive and realized. But this sort of genre fatigue is not specific to open world games. It's not the first time that a genre has seen a massive surge in popularity because the tech has finally caught up to the idea of it. I would say the biggest example of this is how only 3D games were made in the late 90s to early 2000s. For a while, it seemed like two-dimensional design was just considered a crutch that was only reserved for handheld games or systems without enough power to do real 3D. It wasn't until the indie boom that helped bring 2D games back into the spotlight that people seemed to realize that that type of design had more than enough merit on its own. It was almost as if we had forgotten the art of tight 2D design for a second until indie devs brought pixel-perfect platformers back to life. Platformers are just one example, but there are a ton of excellent 2D genres that went a little bit dormant during that era. And kind of by extension of this 3D trend, FPS games dominated the late 2000s. I mean, it felt like every single game in that era was a first-person shooter, even the single-player ones. Take Fallout 3, for example, a game series that was originally a turn-based top-down CRPG that was thrust into the first-person shooter genre by virtue of existing in the year 2008. It doesn't take a marketing genius to understand that this is way more appealing than this, and the sales numbers and the cultural impact obviously show it. But I always found it weird and clunky that in a game with a first-person shooter control scheme, accuracy is not determined by your aim, but by your stats. I've got nothing against RPGs. I mean, I love them, but when you give me a gun and a crosshair in the center of my screen, and I aim at a guy's head and it doesn't explode, what are we even doing here? It's like if you gave me a hammer and then you told me to paint a painting with it. Sure, technically I could use this to put paint on a canvas, but it's not the best tool for the job, and when you first gave me the hammer, I was getting mentally prepared to hit some nails. Compare this to a game like Doom Eternal, which is a first-person shooter in every ounce of its design. Everything in the game is built to complement and enhance the genre as a deliberate design choice. The mood, the level design, the theme, all of it. And the result is a more focused and refined type of game that fully takes advantage of first-person shooters as a medium. Don't get me wrong, Fallout 3 isn't a bad game at all because of this. It's just less focused. My point is, popular genres are going to ebb and flow based on current technology, but the most long-lasting design trends survive because they serve the gameplay, not the hardware. And in my opinion, this is kind of where the open world genre finds itself today, existing a lot of times kind of because it can. But when you make a major design choice like that for the sake of hardware, rather than because the game itself calls for it, you can end up with games that aren't cohesive or don't take advantage of actually being in 3 dimensions or having an open world, or whatever it is. But there is a reason as to why it's trendy in the first place, maybe more so than just 3D versus 2D, and that's immersion, exploration. Like I said, playing Mario Sunshine as a kid, I wanted to explore that entire island. I wanted it to feel seamless and alive and real. And I just know if you had told little 7-year-old me that the new Mario Kart was going to let you drive anywhere, I would have lost my little mind. The appeal is to feel more immersed, to feel more realistic, like you're really in the game world. But who's to say that real life doesn't also have loading zones? Sometimes we need transitions and pauses to help segment and compartmentalize, and that's also a type of realism. There is something to be said about a design that compartmentalizes based on what you, the player, want to focus on. And as this open world market saturates and fatigues players, the games that need to be open world will stay that way. The ones that don't will find better and more useful ways to serve their own design philosophy. I do think eventually we're going to start seeing less open world games, but the ones that remain will be better for it. Breath of the Wild was one of the first big steps toward the refinement of this genre's ethos, with a design that feeds off the idea of the open world, with emergent gameplay, rewarding exploration, and not focusing on the laundry list of main questline things you might have to do to beat the game. There's a reason some people say that the first Legend of Zelda way back on the NES was one of the first true open world games. And it's not because of the hardware. The game came out all the way back in 1986, well before the time of 3D rendering in home consoles. But the reason it can be considered open world is because that core game loop is specifically designed around that concept of exploration and nonlinearity. And not every game benefits from that specific idea, but the ones that do, when they lean into it, can be truly great. Open world games are here to stay, and so are the design trends and ideas that brought them here in the first place. As the genre eventually reaches its equilibrium, what will be the next big trend? Will VR finally catch on for real this time, or will it be something else entirely? I don't know, but I do know this. Hardware will continue to get better and better. We will continue to take advantage of new possibilities, and with each masterpiece that gets released, the bar is raised ever higher. I'm excited to see what new worlds we'll be able to explore in the future. But despite all of that, there's still one open world that can't ever be beat. I think there's a tick on my butt. I'm going back inside.